Welcome to this conference on the economics and ethics of immigration, sponsored by NYU's somewhat grandly named Global Institute for Advanced Study. We thought we'd take the prestige of the advanced study bit and ramp it up a bit. The Global Institute mostly supports multi-year interdisciplinary projects on specific themes, on, for instance, neural computation, the relation between social media and political participation, the future of classical music. You can read about some of these projects if you go to the website. But occasionally also one-time conferences such as this one on urgent topics, and topics especially that are not only urgent but urgently need more light than heat. And this, I think, would qualify. People still ask, what are universities good for? Well, I think this is one of the things that they're good for, is shedding light rather than heat. And it's also very nice that we are able to do it in an interdisciplinary context, because many topics that are of importance and interest to us require different kinds of expertise to be brought into contact with one another. And so it's very, very nice to be able to do that. And as I say, hopefully what we'll have here is a proof of concept that the economists and the philosophers can talk to one another fruitfully, and that we might do various other things in the future. I'm very grateful to the organizers of this conference, specifically Anthony Appia, professor of philosophy and law, my longtime friend and unindicted co-conspirator in various schemes at NYU, Jess Ben Habib, the Paulette Goddard professor of political economy, Giovanni Peri, who is the professor and chair of economics at UC Davis and the founder and director of the Migration Research Cluster, and last but certainly not least, Daniel Viehoff, my new colleague in the philosophy department. As always, everything done by the Global Institute is impeccably organized by Lee Bond, the program administrator, for whom many, many thanks. That's Lee over there in the background. I don't know, she just sets a very high standard, and helped also by Daniel Sharp, one of philosophy's graduate students. So I'd now like to turn the podium over to Giovanni Peri, who will be chairing the first panel. Thank you very much.
Much. Thank all. Thanks to the organizer. Thanks, Lee, also on my side. I'm not going to take any time because we all want to hear from the first panel, which is a first panel of distinguished economists who are going to talk about what are key aspects, key ideas, key points that they have learned about immigration in their research, and they're going to try to stimulate our thoughts about this. So the speaker, I think in order, are Michael Clemens, who's going to go first, and then Jenny Hunt and Chad Sparber. Their vita are on, their short bios are on the flyer. They're all three researchers who are at the frontier in thinking and doing research about economics of migration. So we're very excited to have them here present. I will be just the timekeeper, so I invite Michael to come. I will hold him to the 20-25 minutes line so that we will have a few minutes for questions after each one of these presentations. And then if there are broader questions or other questions that you will want to ask, there will be a panel tonight. So I invite you to keep also in mind other potential questions. So without further ado, I leave it to Michael Clemens.
Thank you so much to Giovanni, to Jess, to Paul for this invitation, and thank you all for being here. Giovanni mentioned questions. My specific question is why I'm wrong. So I'm going to maybe ask you for later about that. I'm going to vindicate migration barriers from three different perspectives. And I'm going to do that by talking about one man named Mabon Hatwood. He's living in Indiana in 1860. Here he is in the US Census of 1860 on that top row, 33-year-old man. He's a black man That second M means mulatto. He's a farmer. His net worth is 200 US dollars, and he's actually not from Indiana. He migrated there from his birthplace of North Carolina. So there's a big problem with Mabon Hatwood, and it's that he is an illegal immigrant. The Constitution of the state is extremely clear. Here is the 13th article of the 1851 Constitution of Indiana. No Negro or mulatto shall come into or settle in the state after the adoption of this Constitution in 1851, and that's exactly what Mabon Hatwood and his family did. So I want to ask a normative question about this policy. Is this the right policy? Is this a good policy? Is it a correct policy? And I'm going to spend 10 minutes arguing to you that it is the right policy, that we can fully justify this policy from a variety of perspectives. Legal, philosophical, and economic. And you can already tell that an economist like me is going way outside of his comfort zone. So that's what I mean when I say the question later today is please articulate to me why I'm mistaken. The legal justification is just extraordinarily clear. This was an unanswerable, crushing display of democratic will. This Article 13 of the Constitution was actually put to a separate referendum because it was considered sensitive. It turned out to be more popular than the rest of the Constitution when it was ratified. This was the vote, 84% in favor. Only 4 counties of Indiana voted against, and even those by a slim margin. There aren't many things in democratic life that receive stronger support than this. So this was clearly the will of the people of Indiana. And it also was subjected to quite rigorous judicial review. Mabon Hatwood was arrested for being an illegal immigrant in 1861. He challenged his conviction in court in Daviess County Court of Common Pleas. He was living southwest of Indianapolis. The judge told him, no, the law is very clear, you're excluded. He appealed to the state Supreme Court. Here's their ruling in 1862, where they told him, we think the statute prohibiting the ingress of Negroes constitutional and its provisions properly placed. So this is not just a spasm of populism. This was very carefully reviewed by the finest legal minds of the political community, and they all agreed that this was correct policy. So it's quite vindicated on legal grounds. What might we find in the philosophical literature, of which I am an amateur consumer at best, to vindicate this policy? Well, many things. Joe Cairns goes through this. Is Joe here right now? Nice to see you. Goes through these in his landmark work. Well, you know, Indiana was full of communities of character, and we learned from Michael Walzer that surely political communities have a right to protect their members' shared sense of what they are about. And the political communities, both local and statewide of Indiana, had made it just unquestionably clear what their communities were about. There's what Joe calls the state responsibility thesis, and this was widely discussed at the time, that allowing black people across the Ohio River into Indiana would in some sense absolve southern states of the consequences of their own flawed institutions, thus delaying the final reckoning that would change those institutions and thus ultimately harming black people. David Miller points out that people who are excluded are at least owed an explanation for their exclusion, but they're not owed much else for this and other reasons. There's the argument of priority for compatriots. I mean, surely Indianans who interact with, work with, intermarry with, have social networks with people owe a lot more to those people than they owe to people who are far outside the communities that they have defined for themselves. And it's just unrealistic cosmopolitan altruism to think that they would weigh the welfare of Mabon Hatwood equally with people that they care about, they often interact with. And you know, not only was Mabon Hatwood not a citizen of Indiana, he wasn't a citizen of the United States. The US Supreme Court in 1857 had made it unquestionably clear that he was not a citizen of Indiana and not a citizen of the United States. He was far beyond their political community. And finally, there are arguments for sovereignty and self-determination. Surely political communities have a natural right to preserve the public order and shared cultural traits. All of these were very sophisticatedly invoked at the time by brilliant and talented and intellectual people. There's a full transcript of the 4-month Constitutional Convention of 1850 in Indiana. So you can see all of the reasons they brought in. Here's James Raridan representing Wayne County, Indiana. I am opposed to the immigration of Negroes in this state. 2 reasons: because it would greatly tend to the interest of the slave owner and tend to rivet still faster the chains which bind the Negro. This is the state responsibility argument, that we are, by letting mulattoes like Maven Hatwood into Indiana, we are absolving the South of consequences for their own institutional decisions, and therefore delaying the day at which blacks will be freed. Thus, we're actually harming the interests of blacks in general by allowing Maven Hatwood in. And second, I am still further opposed to their coming here because their presence will inevitably create disquiet among us. So here is the natural right of self-determination to preserve the public order. Now, this wasn't just the odd gentleman standing up at the Constitutional Convention. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Taney, in 1857, when he ruled that all people, free and or enslaved of African descent, were not citizens of the United States and not citizens of any state in particular, mocked the very idea of thinking otherwise precisely because the consequence would be open borders. Here's what he wrote. It would give to persons of the Negro race the right to enter every other state whenever they pleased, to sojourn there as long as they pleased, to go where they pleased, the full liberty of speech in public and in private upon all subjects which its own citizens might speak, to hold public meetings upon political affairs, and to keep and carry arms wherever they went. Parentheses, obviously they would conspire to violent political revolution. And it is hardly consistent with the respect due to these states to suppose that they regarded at that time as fellow citizens and members of the sovereignty, at that time, the formation of the Constitution, a class of beings whom they had thus stigmatized, whom, as we are bound out of respect to the state sovereignties, to assume they had deemed it just and necessary to stigmatize. This is an argument of philosophical principle. He doesn't, Justice Taney is not saying we need any evidence that Maben Hatwood himself was engaged in a violent conspiracy to overthrow the political and social order of Indiana. He is saying that the fact that many Indianans felt that he might be is sufficient for his exclusion to be just. So Maben Hatwood's exclusion is amply justified by many strands of the philosophical literature. I'm an economist, so let me look to the economic evidence for how we could vindicate the exclusion of Maben Hatwood. The focus of the immigration economics literature, which is really a subfield of labor economics, fortunately less and less so, but historically it has certainly been that, has been effects on the prices of labor, particularly on the prices of labor in subpopulations. So this is extremely clear. At this time, 2/3 of the workforce of Indiana had not even completed primary school. So this is a low-skill, undifferentiated workforce that's going to be competing directly with low-skill, undifferentiated immigrants coming in from the South. And that could be expected to hurt their wages, particularly of the most vulnerable, and this was the top concern expressed by many at the time. So here is the 1864 platform of the Democratic Party of Indiana: that the people of Indiana, having inhibited by the state constitution and law the entrance of free Negroes and mulattoes into this state, and as the present disturbances on our border are likely to bring in an influx of that population, ask the public authorities of Indiana to see that the Constitution and laws are enforced on that subject. When the people of Indiana adopted that Negro exclusion clause by a majority of 90,000 votes, they meant the honest, laboring white man should have no competitor in the black race. And this was a major theme as well of the Constitutional Convention back in 1850, labor market competition. And certainly the leading economists of the time, John Stuart Mill among them, made it very clear that we could expect consequences of this kind from influxes of labor. There were also many concerns about assimilation to norms and institutions, particularly concerns about the perceived criminality of black people. Decades later, in a landmark statistical work published in the flagship journal of the American Economic Association by Frederick Hoffman, there are 100 pages of statistics from all over the United States arguing that American blacks were inherently criminal. So if somebody in Indiana wanted to seek in economic research a justification for excluding Maben Hatwood, they would not need to look far. Finally, many of the concerns expressed regarded public health, the physical and biological integrity of people in Indiana, in the Constitutional Convention, they cited by name the work of Louis Agassiz of Harvard University, arguably the leading American scientist of the time, not some flaming racist, not a fool in the street, but he was a person who had studied biology all over the world and had concluded that people of African descent were a different species of hominid from white Indianans. And they referred to his research in their deliberations. There was no shortage of economists either. Here is Bill Ripley, professor of political economy at Harvard, before that a professor of economics at MIT, who did research around the world and concluded that black brains were, quote, more primitive and more simian than the brains of people who were not black. So again, if you wanted to produce from economic research, from the leading economists of the day, reasons to exclude Mabin Hatwood from Indiana, you would find little trouble vindicating those opinions. So in the internet age, unfortunately, things like this have to be said. I don't actually subscribe to any of these conclusions at all. I violently oppose nearly all of the conclusions I've just reached. And the reason that I set them out there is to challenge, I hope, maybe some corner of your own thinking within your own discipline about migration barriers. So let me do that. What are some objections that we could raise on legal, philosophical, and economic grounds? I have no legal expertise, and this is an economics and philosophy conference, so I don't want to spend too much time on legal objections, but we are in a law school. So I do want to point out that just 4 years after Mabin Hatwood's arrest as being an illegal immigrant, the Supreme Court of Indiana declared all black residents of Indiana citizens of the state, just 4 years later, and it was only 3 years after that the United States amended the Constitution to make all US-born people of African descent, like him and his children, US citizens. So really, if there was the jurisprudence of the time was incredibly fragile, apparently, and maybe should have undergone a more rigorous scrutiny in its own context. But let me get right to the philosophical objections. Each of the philosophical vindications that I just raised for Mabin Hatwood's exclusion is invoked frequently in the philosophical literature justifying, vindicating the exclusion of international migrants. Joe Cairns goes through each of these in his book, and so much better than I could that I would be embarrassed to go through it in his presence. Just to cite an example, when discussing Walzer's argument for communities of character, he might argue, and could tell me that I'm wrong, that it's unclear why white Indianians have an unqualified right to live in communities that they like, but Mabin Hatwood, who is not a citizen of the United States and not a citizen of Indiana, does not have any right to live in a community of the character that he desires. And many other very rich and I think just challenging and persuasive arguments about each of these. I don't want to go through them. I want to mention a few arguments that I hear less about. The philosophers could easily tell me that these are that they dealt with these in many ways long ago, but I hear them less discussed. One is that the argument that we owe more to our compatriots often overlooks, to me, the fact that coercing the relations of outsiders to insiders requires, de facto, almost always coercing insiders. So Loren Lamaski mentions this in some of his work, and surely other philosophers do, but I don't hear it very frequently. Barring an employment relationship between an American and a foreigner is certainly barring that foreigner from working, but it's also barring the native from employing that person. And more broadly, if I am a member of a political community and I want friends who are foreigners, I want employees who are foreigners, barriers to their arrival, barriers to their presence, barriers to their work are also coercive upon me as a member of the political community. And I don't see that complexity discussed fully as frequently as it should be. Another is the asymmetry of harm and benefit. I've been mocked for being a thoughtless cosmopolitan. I'm certainly not a cosmopolitan, and I think the argument that all of us care more about the people proximate to us in social and geographic ways than those who are further is very compelling. What I don't see too much discussed is a point made by, and this won't surprise you at all, that one of my favorite philosophers is also an economist, good old Adam Smith. In the Theory of Moral Sentiments, he writes, "To hear perhaps of the death of another person with whom we have no particular connection will give us less concern than a very insignificant disaster which has befallen ourselves. Obviously, we care more about ourselves and the people proximate to us than about others. But though the ruin of our neighbor may affect us much less than a very small misfortune of our own, we must not ruin him to prevent that small misfortune, nor even to prevent our own ruin." That is, the fact that we care much less, drastically less, about people distant from us is not an unlimited justification to do harm to them. And I think the fact that Indianans obviously and justifiably would care less about somebody like Mabon Hatwood, who is quite different from them in many ways and is not from where they're from and is not a citizen of their political community, does not justify all forms of harm that they could do to him. Third, and this is where I've not been able to convince any philosopher that I'm thinking correctly, I've always been troubled by the circular reasoning of political communities. Why is it fine for Indiana to exclude Mabon Hatwood? Well, because he's not a member of the political community. Why isn't he a member of the political community? Because they excluded him. And we know that because the law changed a few years later and suddenly he was a member of the political community. But that's kind of a dog chasing its tail. And finally, there's the abhorrent consequence of this logic, which I think raises its own concerns. Now let me talk about something I know slightly more about, although not as much as I would like to, which is the economic objections to the points I just raised, the economic vindications for excluding Mabon Hatwood. Yes, labor market effects could arise in the simplest models of the labor market. Boghossian has remarkable research showing that when blacks actually did end up moving later in large numbers to the north, they didn't compete much with whites in the labor market, largely because of occupational segregation. White machinists were not competing with black porters. And there's a lot of other research now. Raj Chetty, Nate Hendren, and Larry Katz have shown that some of the differences between blacks and whites that were assumed to be inherent and immutable long ago could arise from the neighborhood you grew up in. They do that with very rigorous research showing, for example, randomly allocating the opportunity to live elsewhere. But here again, there are some objections that I just don't hear enough about. If we were to study the arrival of Mabon Hatwood in Indiana, primarily in terms of its wage effects on white people, and that, I'm sorry to say, is a caricature, but not a terrible caricature of much of the labor economics literature on immigration from the last few decades, we would find that really bizarre just thinking about it. I mean, obviously the arrival of black people in Indiana had all kinds of effects, and white people responded in many, many ways than just bidding down wages. They made different investments. They made different human capital investments. They specialized across occupations. They specialized within occupations. And this is where some of the research of Jenny and Chad, who are about to come up here, and Giovanni, Peri, and others who are doing some of the newer and I think just vastly more interesting work on international migration are focusing their attention. But a lot of it misses something else, and this is where I come to my own research. One of my papers talks about the global GDP gains, global efficiency gains from more migration. And think about Mabon Hatwood from that perspective. So Bill Collins and Marianne Wanamaker find that just the act of moving from south to north is responsible for much of the convergence, potentially all of the convergence between black and white outcomes early in the 20th century. Pair that with another finding by Andy Brimmer and later by P. Klenow and co-authors, arguing that something like 4% of all US economic growth post-war, post-World War II, was due to convergence of economic outcomes between blacks and whites. Now, if migration played a big role in that, the bottom line is today, right now, the United States is hundreds of billions of dollars richer every year because of the migration of people like Mabon Hatwood from south to north. Now, you could say that doesn't matter much to the people who were debating in 1850, and it certainly didn't. None of them brought it up. If I came to them in a time machine and showed them statistical studies of the GDP gains, they'd think it was bizarre and they wouldn't care. But think, looking back on them now from our perspective, how strange it is that they didn't think about that. how much we've benefited. I mean, in the most tangible ways, Michael Jackson grew up in Gary, Indiana, and wouldn't if he had been excluded. That's the way I would explain to somebody on 3rd Street. But you know, we should be able to think more sophisticatedly about that, how the entire economy of the United States and its technological change, its inventors, its entrepreneurs, the many, many complexities other than very, very simple models of the labor market were affected by the exclusion of Mabon Hatwood. And I want to close with 2 points. First, I say all of this for 2 reasons. One is to just probe in a very superficial way the relative merits of these different approaches. The legal approach has its merits and is very precise and pragmatic. If you need to decide whether Mabon Hatwood is illegal or not, that's a determination that must be made. You can't be an economist and say, well, on one hand and on the other hand, and it has that advantage, while at the same time it can come to occasionally monstrous outcomes, which I believe the exclusion of Mabon Hatwood was. The philosophical approach, among its many virtues, and this is where economists just really fall down badly, is in discussing where the burden of proof should be placed. And this is something that's been criticized from within by Deirdre McCloskey and a few others, but they're seen as kind of fringe figures for having the gall to do that. If you spend your entire life probing whether natives' wages went down by 1% or 3% due to the arrival of immigrants and not much else, when I see that research, I think, well, what if you had spent your entire life studying whether the wages of men fell in response to women entering the labor market, which they did, David Otter and other finds. But if you based your whole career on that and you thought that that was the most important question that needed to be answered about immigration economics, you're really placing the burden of proof in a very strange place that you haven't thought much about. And not just that, but it's a core problem in the discipline, in that if you went to an econ seminar and talked about the philosophical reasons for placing the burden of proof on admission or placing the burden of proof on exclusion, you'd be thrown out. No econ journal would accept such a paper, and no econ seminar would invite you to discuss such things. And that's a criticism of Deirdre McCloskey's that has never been really adequately answered by the whole discipline. Economists, I think, really contribute when talking about trade-offs. And Joe Cairns talks about this in his book, that there's the problem of lifeboat ethics that is frequently discussed in the immigration literature. You know, if you let everybody into the lifeboat and the lifeboat sinks, it can't be unethical to keep them out because the outcome is that everybody dies. Economists are good at marginal analysis and opportunity cost and other intellectual tools that they focus on, as well as empirical statistical questions like, well, how would we determine whether one more person would actually sink the lifeboat? Well, how about the next person? Well, how about the next person? And that's just a much more useful technique for answering certain kinds of questions that philosophers regard rightly as contingent and outside of the purview of certain forms of analysis, where economists can really complement philosophers and really do something that's very, very valuable. The second reason I say all of this, and this is where I'll conclude, is just to point out that my goal today is to have you think within your own discipline, maybe in other disciplines too, but within your own discipline. If you see a persuasive argument for the exclusion of a particular kind of immigrant, think through very carefully in your head whether that same argument could have justified the exclusion of Mabon Hatwood from Indiana. And unfortunately, my claim is that most of them, you'll find, would have. And that is something that should cause you, I claim, to carefully reconsider the persuasiveness of that argument. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Michael. You really did your homework well. You brought us in the middle of the debate and you included. So we have 5 minutes for questions. So Michael will stay here and will take questions if you have immediate reaction, clarification, responses. And as I said, there will be another opportunity to ask questions which may be broader and maybe require more time. So if there are 2 or 3 questions, I let Michael just take them and then we'll go to the next panelist.
Thank you. I'd love to just hear them rather than answer them because 5 minutes is so short, and maybe we can have a richer discussion later. So if there are reasons I'm wrong, I would love to hear them and leave myself defenseless for the time being. from economists or philosophers. An alternative is that we go right to Jenny and Chad, which I would be perfectly happy.
Just raise the hand and Michael will. You have a question? Yes, sorry, there is a question. Yeah, you can directly.
Okay, Michael, I want to challenge you on something that I have been challenged on in analogous circumstances. It was, so to be credible in this debate on migration, if you're using purely descriptive economic arguments on like the effect on wages or the effect on natives or something, can you convince the other side that you credibly could have found the opposite? You could have found migration was terrible as far as its descriptive effects. Can you sort of convince the other side that you, in some sense, did not start with a political agenda, that you hated, migration restrictions and xenophobia, and, sort of were biased in the direction of finding descriptive results of migration that would sort of support your case? I believe you, but the question is whether the other side will believe you, that you're being credible on this.
Thank you. The problem is I could talk for 10 minutes on that. Maybe one other question, sure. and then if there's 1 minute left, I would say something briefly, but that's not to ignore you, Bill.
If there is another.
Or I could just to say a word about that, which is a fascinating point. I mean, it's very close to home because, I've been publicly accused of being somebody who doesn't care about the evidence, and it's very ideological. And I think a lot of that arises from this question of where we place the burden of proof. I don't think that Deirdre McCloskey makes this point in the rhetoric of economics, that there is, no matter where you place the burden of proof, you're choosing an ideology. It's not that some are ideological and some aren't. Some are very transparent about it. So here, Leia's research is one I would hold up as a shining example. Her paper on the emigration of blacks from the south to northern cities, 1940 to 1970, actually finds if you don't control for, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you don't control for the way that the quality of education acquired in the South differentiates people in the northern labor markets, you actually could arrive at the conclusion that there was severe competition with white workers. Once you do that, that goes away. So it makes it extraordinarily clear, here is what you need to believe in order to believe that there is this extraordinarily large competition result. Here is what you need to believe in order not to. And then arrive at your own conclusions. And really, I don't see another solution to it than that. But just, having some standard by which some economists are ideological and some aren't is unsustainable in that the placement of a burden of proof reflects assumptions that are pre-scientific. This is, I think, a very profound point that Deirdre McCloskey makes that I really think more economists should think carefully about. The way that she words it, if I remember right, is all you economists who say you're being scientific and testing hypotheses, tell me how you chose the hypothesis you're testing. And that's usually not by the scientific method. In fact, it almost can't be done by the scientific method. All the best we could possibly hope for is to say, under these assumptions you get this results, under these others you don't. I aspire to do that in my work, but I think I fall drastically short of that ideal, and we could do much better about that.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
So,
okay, thank you very much. I'm going to talk about what is the best immigration policy in the context of what do economists have to say about this. And the emphasis is actually going to be on our limitations and in particular on how we need philosophical help. If I look like I'm trying to practice as an unlicensed philosopher, that's actually not the case, or it's deliberately to show you how bad a philosopher I am and how much we in general, though Michael seems to be an exception, need your help. And I'll talk briefly about some of my own work since we were told to do that, but that's a little bit shoehorned in here. So obviously, the first question about what is the best immigration policy I'm thinking of for a national government, say the United States, is the best policy for whom? So is it for the whole world? Is it for the United States? Is it for firms? Is it for workers, so perhaps firms all over the world, or workers all over the world? Or is it for the immigrants? Is it for US natives? Is it for the poorest people in the world? Is it for the most frightened people in the world? And in particular, in connection with this last question, which is obviously about refugees, I want to start actually with a question I hope the philosophers can help me with later, which is if we're thinking in particular about refugees, do we have more obligations for people closer to us, whoever us is, than people farther away? So whether we're talking about immigrants or refugees, if we're the European Union, should we take North Africans? Should we prioritize them before Afghans because they're closer to us in distance and perhaps far back in time in culture? And in terms of refugees, what should the choice be between the refugees who've arrived on the European border compared to those who are languishing in refugee camps in Africa? So that's a very concrete example of somewhere where I think about the news as someone who works on immigration, and I don't know how to think about it. So what I'm bringing up, of course, is that the best choice, or the choice of the best policy is not something that can be objectively defined. It's subjective, and it all depends on how we weight people in some social welfare function that we have. And each individual person has their own social welfare function, or perhaps we don't even have one, many of us, because we don't know how to formulate one. And you could boil that down to, if we have $1 left, who do we want to give that dollar to? So what can economists contribute, and what do we value? Well, what we're best at is just saying, all right, we weight everyone equally. We don't know how to make this choice, and we're happy to give our dollar to anyone. And then if we're thinking about some policy, we think about how it just changes the incomes of the various groups. If we're lucky, we can work that out. Let's assume that we can. That is what we're supposed to be good at. So let's just say we can do that. And then our social welfare function is we just add all of this up and we see what happens to the aggregate. Now, microeconomists are not quite as guilty of that as macroeconomists are. That's their job by definition almost, but nevertheless, we're all somewhat guilty of that. And so this is why we tend to focus on the size of the economic pie, total income, and of course I've put totally to one side something about utility or how happy people are or other non-economic considerations. So right, we're focusing on the size of the pie. So in the first step, actually, economists are on pretty sure ground here. We know that what maximizes the size of the pie, talking about migration, is free mobility. That's just a very simple thing relying on basic economic principles. It maximizes the world pie, but it also maximizes the American pie, the rest of the world pie, everyone's pie. At least any group's pie is bigger, not any individual's pie, but any group's pie is bigger if you have free mobility. And that's also true, by the way, of the US native-born pie as well. So what's the hitch in this? Well, one hitch is that in this very simple but fundamental economic model we have, there isn't any welfare system in any country. And so we're assuming here that immigrants receive no support from the government. And in fact, you could allow free mobility to your country and just say that the immigrants won't get any support from the government. And so, for example, in the US, we have something a little bit like this for about 20 years, that even people with green cards can't access many benefits for 5 years. And when the UK permitted the EU immigrants from the expansion countries to come to Britain, they specified they would not get any benefits. You could also add an additional tax to immigrants to cancel out the benefit they might be getting from benefits, and then you would get back to free mobility is the best. Okay? But the second hitch is that there are winners and losers. As for any policy. So I worked in the Obama administration. I noticed there's this big demand for policies that are Pareto improving, that make everyone better off. Those policies would be very popular. Unfortunately, they don't really exist, and immigration is no exception. And But okay, so free mobility is the best for overall, but people might have distributional issues. Plus, they might not believe economists that it's actually the best for the overall size of the pie. And at the end of the day, free mobility is actually off the table, I think, in pretty much any country right now. And so now that we've said our piece about free mobility being best, once that's off the table, what can we do? And I want to tell you, not very much. Economists cease to be very helpful after we've told you that immigration is good for you as a group. So the theory doesn't tell you anything about what the second best number of immigrants is after the number that want to come. So if you, the non-economists, come to us and you say we have scenario A or policy A and policy B, if we're really lucky, we might be able to simulate them. Let's just say we can simulate them, and we can compare them for the overall size of the pie is in the different cases. Even that would be difficult, but it seems pretty clear that people are not interested only in the overall size of the pie, but also the distribution. Some people don't really care about within workers, but they care about firms versus workers, or some people care a lot about the distribution among workers. And then we're already into the business of needing to put weights on people, and economists don't know how to do that, and furthermore, it's not clear the policymakers should just make that up themselves. You'd have to somehow get people's preferences and aggregate them, famously difficult. Okay, so just to give you a couple of impossible questions that were asked of economists during the reform attempts in 2013 that I was participating in. So one thing we were asked is, what's the optimal number of H-1B visas? The answer is really no idea. Another one was a very interesting idea, was to try tie the number of H-2B visas to the state of the economy and have some trigger. For example, if the unemployment rate gets above this level, we'll cut the H-2B visas down to this level. What's the optimal trigger? Well, it's fun to think about, but again, the real answer is no idea. So what can, in fact, economists contribute? So one is, and Michael's been talking about this, we can try and understand the mechanisms through which migration affects economies, and we can identify the winners and losers, but without telling you what to do about them. And so one of the, in some sense, this is a conclusion, at least a part of what I'm talking about, is, and I think that if we were at all consistent in our economic advice and we were not worrying about political things, and we usually don't actually, so that would also be consistent, is we would end up recommending more immigration, actually really in all countries, but thinking specifically about the US, which is only a medium immigration country, we would recommend an increase. And that would be consistent with us saying that innovation is good, that we should have free trade. It would be very inconsistent if we didn't say that lots of immigration was good. That doesn't mean we would be right, but it would be consistent with our principles about increasing the size of the pie. Now, at the same time, however, we should, as economists, propose methods of helping the losers, but methods or policies that would be something other than stopping immigration, that would hopefully leave you with still a bigger pie. Okay, so if I had an hour and a half now, I could talk to you about many mechanisms. Because I don't, I'll just talk to you about one way that immigration affects the US economy that I've studied. And if I had more time, I would respond to Michael's challenge to say how I chose this question, but I'll skip that. And again, we actually get to the question of, and what I'm going to look at is the effect of immigrants on innovation. And so I'm assuming here we think innovation is good, although as I say, if you think immigration is bad, you could think innovation is bad on the same reasoning. And so what's the effect of immigrants on innovation? We come back to the question, whose innovation are we interested in? Is it the world's? Is it the US's? And here I'm going to argue that they're similar, they're sort of the same thing. Because foreign innovation is beneficial for other countries. You can either import the new products or the now cheaper products, or you can adopt the technology and make them at home, the new products. The innovation abroad might be an input to innovation at home. But there is a little bit of evidence that innovation at home might be more beneficial to home than innovation abroad, Just one reason might be that it arrives sooner if you do it at home than if it's abroad. But all of this does say, and so this does say that the US should continue to foster innovation and not simply free ride on other countries, which will be one consequence of thinking it's world innovation that matters. And so coming to immigration, how would immigration raise local innovation? Let's again think specifically about the US, which I think is a particularly interesting case here. It could be that you're just increasing the population, and the more people you have, the more ideas you have. It could be that the immigrants that have come or that you've let in are just somehow inherently more innovative, or they might have more complementary skills to innovation, like entrepreneurship. And if they are more innovative, it could be because they're naturally more talented, or because they're more educated or more specialized in the relevant fields of study through either self-selection or the immigration system. And I think I'll actually skip that slide. And so my own work in a couple of papers has tried to get at the causal effect of skilled immigration on US patenting per capita. And this work, some of it was done jointly with Marjolaine Gauthier-Loisel. And here the idea is to include any spillover effects, whether they're positive or negative, on the native-born innovators or potential innovators. And this graph doesn't actually get at the causal part, but this just shows you in the self-reported data over a period of 1998 to 2003, which is the only time we have it, the share of these people who have a patent that was actually commercialized, so is presumably an indicator of quality, because with patents we hope they represent innovation, but there's all sorts of reasons why it's imperfect, and some of them are not very useful. But if they're commercialized, presumably they are pretty useful. And about 0.5% of natives have a commercialized, or had a commercialized patent that they commercialized over a 5-year period, and it's more than twice that, a bit more than 1% of the immigrants. And if you're interested in some other groups, here they are. It's mainly men who patent, for example, and I have a different paper on that. And but when I go to trying to look at causality, I do find that there's a causal effect, and in fact, it doesn't seem to be simply that the immigrants patented more, but they actually caused the natives to patent more as well, so there's a positive spillover. And to get an idea of the magnitude, over the 1990s, the patents per capita rose 63%, and about 1/3 of that can be attributed to the increased immigration of college graduates. And then if you take the little bit of evidence linking patenting with the growth in GDP per capita, that meant that over that 10-year period, GDP per capita was higher by a sort of 1.5 to 2.5%, which is not a huge amount, but it's going to compound every decade, because that's a change actually in the growth rate rather than just the level. I don't quite have time to talk about why there's a slight bit of contrary evidence, but nevertheless, this is an important contribution of immigrants, that they increase innovation and therefore the growth in GDP per capita, and therefore it has the potential actually to offset, at least in the long run, which could be long, any harmful effects, say, on low-skilled immigrants. We think in the short term, native high school dropouts actually have their wages decreased, but in the long run, this faster growth could end up making them beneficiaries as well. So what are the criteria that one should have for an immigration policy? And again, I'm assuming that we've taken free mobility, having no policy, off the table. So let's start by saying that we're not only going to restrict immigration, but the goal is going to be the well-being of the native-born population. Although interestingly, the guidelines for the US government, they don't say anything about being native-born, they say US workers. So you're supposed to actually consider potential immigration in terms of whether it would hurt any worker who's already here, which would therefore include actually the immigrant who arrived yesterday should not be hurt by today's immigrant, which is a very demanding standard actually. And I'm mostly not going to be thinking about refugees here, but surely one would have hoped until recently that they were an exception to this policy of maximizing the well-being of natives. Okay, so should we pick immigrants who will contribute most to US natives, which are sometimes called as needed immigrants, although I really dislike using the word need in connection with economics? Or, and here's sort of the other thing people think about a lot, should we accept the people who assimilate best to the US? That actually seems to be something that a lot of natives have in mind about what's successful immigration. It's how well the immigrants assimilate without either equating that with what they're contributing or ignoring what they're contributing. I'm not sure which it is, but they're not actually the same thing at all. In fact, they could be opposite things, because what economic theory tells us is that the types of immigrants who increase most the size of the pie, including of natives, are immigrants who are different from natives. That's where the benefit actually comes from. If they're identical, you expect to end up with just more of everything and the same prices as before, a bit like having more children. So the pie gets bigger if you have immigrants who are different, and so the more they assimilate, the less their contribution is going to be. And the reason that different immigrants contribute the most, or one way of looking at it, is that it allows everyone to specialize more in what they're best in, and that increases efficiency. So in some sense, contribution and assimilation are actually opposite things. But the bad news is that, bad news if you want to measure contribution is that's much harder to measure than assimilation. We're actually pretty good at measuring assimilation. So what could be some reasons for prioritizing assimilation? This is where I get back to dabbling, but only to show you how bad I am at it in philosophy. So one would be that you have sort of a Rawlsian nationalist philosophy, which is that which would lead you to want to exclude immigrants who would harm the wages of low-skilled natives. That the second bullet point may or may not follow directly from the first, but certainly it's suggesting you're focusing on the home country rather than the whole world. Another interesting reason is there is some work by political scientists that suggests that the public has a greater acceptance of skilled immigrants. This is on data in the US and Canada that I've seen. And so you might be willing to trade off, even if you wanted to bring unskilled immigrants because they gain more from the migration than the skilled immigrants do, you might be willing to trade that off against getting in more total immigrants, but skilled because they're more accepted by the public. But I think that the reason actually that people focus the most on assimilation is that I think non-economists are mostly just thinking about the contribution or subtraction to the government budget. And so I think that by assimilation, people are thinking just earning high wages, and they're thinking that people who earn high wages make net contributions to the budget through taxes and not taking much out in terms of benefits, and that's really what the contribution is. Whereas, as I've just suggested to you, that's not what economists think of as being the main issue. So high migration could be more acceptable if it's skilled, and maybe that's why people in Canada really love immigrants, because of their point system, bringing in skilled people. Switzerland's referendum a few years ago that seemed to be in revolt against Germans and French coming to Switzerland, though seems perhaps to be a counterexample. So suppose we go back now to identifying those who contribute the most, if we think that contribution is what matters. One issue is who gets to decide who contributes the most. So if you're thinking about some area with free mobility like the European Union, then it's sort of the market that decides. But some immigration policies allow firms to decide, and so the US has some immigration programs like the H-1B or H-2B where the firms decide. But the US actually allows universities to be big selectors of immigrants, and also families, and so in addition to the government. So these groups might choose different people. And there's some advantages if you're thinking purely about economics to the firms choosing, because they're not close to the market, they're in the market, they're one side of the market, and so they know who's going to be productive. An advantage of universities choosing is that they're going to give human capital that works well in the host country. So the host country can save money by importing people who already have their university degrees, but they don't transfer with 100% efficiency in terms of wages and productivity. But all of this leaves open the question of what about people, actual or potential entrepreneurs, when you're trying to micromanage who is coming, and the Obama administration actually was proposing an entrepreneurial visa. It's very hard, it's even harder to pick entrepreneurs than it is to pick other types of people that you think are going to be productive. I have some things that I think the government should not use as criteria, but I'll skip over those and come to the conclusion. So, because the economics would really say you should have free immigration, I think we can say that immigration policy is not really based on economics, and that this ignoring economic policy there is a bit inconsistent with supporting innovation and free trade, although admittedly more and more people don't support free trade either. And any immigration policy is inherently subjective, so I find it touching that people turn to economists. It makes me feel happy thinking that we can help, but our contributions really are not what people think that they are, because even focusing purely on economics, you need to pick a social welfare function. So what we can do is we can point out things like low-skilled immigrants actually also benefit the receiving country because of, for example, this that leads to increased specialization and efficiency. We can point out the results of a consensus report that I was a member of the committee of from the National Academies, saying that average wages are not hurt by immigration. And we can point out things like immigration increases innovation and growth. And that potentially that means that in the long run, even short run losers could gain. And an important thing is that we can point out that there are policies that could help those losers, and that the combination of those policies and more and higher immigration would be economically beneficial. So that's really what we can do. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Jenny, lots of questions and things to think about. Any question, quick reaction to Jenny's presentation? Yes.
So I just had a question. I think it was the question you decided to skip at the very end. Because you do say low-skilled immigrants also benefit the receiving country, but obviously what we might care about is the comparative question. So low-skilled as opposed to high-skilled immigrants, if we think we want to have a limited number of immigrants coming in. And so why did you seem to be suggesting on the slide that you skipped that we wouldn't want the government to pick for high skills?
So you give me the excuse to talk about this slide that I skipped. So something I've given a lot of thought to is how good is a point system, which has become topical. The president likes to call it a merit-based system, and it certainly will pick the people who will be best for the budget. And if the skilled immigrants are even more skilled than natives, it still has that benefit of increased specialization that I talked about. So it certainly will also be beneficial along those dimensions. Won't be quite as beneficial as if you also continued to admit the immigrants that we have in the US who are actually less skilled than all the natives. But this system ignores a couple of things: the benefits of the low-skilled people and the importance of firms in selecting the people who are going to be the most productive in the US. And I think that the countries that we think of as being the main point system countries have actually recognized this now, and they've moved in the last 5 years, except for Quebec, which is a country that has its own immigration policy, which is the definition of a country. They've moved to a hybrid system of points where the government continues to determine the points and have a points threshold, but then among the people who pass that threshold, it's the people that firms pick who are actually admitted, whereas before, if you could pass the threshold and move to the country without any job, now at least one part, Australia seems to have about 50 different ways of going to Australia, but at least one part of it, as in New Zealand and Canada, is you go through the normal points, but then prioritize the people who perhaps even before they applied, but otherwise after the firms can actually look at the set of people who've passed the threshold, they can be selected by the firms. So that seems like it's actually quite promising as a system, and the advantage of that over one that accepted more unskilled people would be a greater public acceptance, I think. It is a little bit hard to trade off the immigrants, the low-skilled immigrants who are less good for the budget than other people against the helping with the efficiency. It's hard to measure that.
But I'm intrigued with the constant attempt to encourage entrepreneurial transfer. And I wanted to ask, isn't it the case that because an immigrant community is, in its sense, its own niche market, and because of the difficulty of transfer of skills in the mid-range, that by definition, many of the people who come serve their own population and their entrepreneurial skills are advanced. So just through the pure economics of having to make a living in a milieu where the skill transfer is different.
Yes, that's a good combination question, comment. So certainly one finds that more immigrants than natives are self-employed, and sometimes the papers call that being an entrepreneur, but the literature on self-employment divides self-employed people into people who are self-employed because their ordinary job prospects were even worse, and then people who are self-employed because they have a fantastic idea that's actually better than a good job in dependent employment. And the data on entrepreneurship, if it's defined as you also employed someone else, which would be a good marker for the good kind of, or the kind of self-employment that's likely to contribute to growth, the data are very bad, so it's hard to tell. But I should have said that one of the reasons for the concerns about entrepreneurship, in addition to the idea that, almost by definition, I would say actually, is that these are people who either have the technology ideas themselves or have the business starting skills that can be combined with it. Most of the visas that many of the visas people come to the US on prohibit self-employment. And so if you had such an idea, you would have to find, and that's what people do, an American or green card holder to help you start the company. But the idea is that this is important because it contributes more to growth, perhaps, than the average dependent employment.
But I'm actually thinking of a mid-range. So, phenomena that we see in urban areas. There are immigrant populations that tend to cluster in certain mid-range entrepreneurial occupations. The Chinese have done a lot in expanding in the cleaning area. Koreans have been greengrocers here. They're employing other people. They're pooling their own resources. They are transferring their business skills, but their other skills don't transfer. And I'm wondering if anybody's looked at that.
I was taking that to be the comment part of your thing because, yes, I agree with that. And people do try to study that, but at least for economists trying to use representative large databases, the data aren't very good. But certainly that exists, and I agree with you that that's important and interesting.
One more quick. Just a question of clarification. The point about the relationship between assimilation and contribution was a little quick. And you said like they were opposites. The slide had a non-equal sign. And I was up wondering exactly what you took the relationship between those two characteristics, assimilability and ability to contribute, to be. And then what speculation you might have about what causes that relationship. So is it like some inverse relationship? Is it true by definition that the more similar people are to the natives, by definition, the less able they are?
Not quite, so I overstated it a little bit. So it might be useful again to split into what is the contribution of immigrants to budgets through taxes minus what any benefits they're receiving, versus what are they contributing to the economy in the marketplace in terms of contributing to growth or complementing or substituting for other workers, and that kind of and allowing more specialization and efficiency in the economy. So just in terms of the budget, the immigrants usually come to the US earning below what people of their education would, in any case, their education and especially experience. And so assimilation usually means an increase in wages. There could be some other dimensions in which an assimilation means going down to the US level, but in terms of wages, it means usually going up. And so for the budget, assimilation is good because the more you're earning, the better you are for the federal, state, or local budget. But in terms of contributing to increased efficiency of the economy, it could actually be bad because it's the immigrants being different from natives that allows increased specialization. If then over time they come to look exactly like the natives, they're not subtracting anything from, but it'll just mean a bigger economy just like it was before, with no increased specialization.
Thank you. So the comment on entrepreneurship that you made made me think that, so there is actually quite a big literature in sociology studying sort of case studies of entrepreneurship, and even in New York, the example you were, so I'm thinking the next conference will also have them, maybe to add another aspect to the question. Now I'm very happy to have Chad Sparber talk more about skilled immigration or innovation.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I'd like to talk about immigration as an increase in the country's supply of skills. What I'm kind of motivated by, or where I think a useful place to begin this discussion, is to think about what we might think the predicted effect of immigration on wages paid to American-born workers might be. When you pose this question, I think a lot of people kind of have in mind a simple supply and demand framework that might come from an introduction to economics textbook in a short-run model, where you look at the supply and demand of wages paid to labor. The intersection of supply and demand determines some equilibrium wage. And so when immigrants come into the country, what they do is they increase the supply of labor. That then decreases the wage paid to all workers, and then therefore that implies that Americans get paid less money when immigrants come in. So I think that's the kind of model that a lot of people have in mind, especially when they're fearing what immigration might do. But what I want to do is ask whether this simple model's prediction is correct, and I'm going to argue that actually it's not correct at all. And so what I'd like to do is think about what are the actual effects of immigration on wages paid to American workers. And so that to me is an interesting question. Where's Michael? Because I'm interested in asking sort of empirically testable questions, right? And this is an empirical question we can answer. And it turns out that most studies, not all studies, but I think most of them argue that wages don't actually decline in response to immigration, that a lot of the studies find results that cluster around 0, with some being positive and some negative, but all of them being pretty small. And if you believe that, then it implies that this basic introduction to economics textbook model is inherently flawed, that there's something wrong with it. And so we might ask ourselves, what are the culprits? Now, there are a lot of different potential answers to this that people come up with. The one that my co-authors and I have focused a lot on is to think about skills, to focus on a skills story with immigration. And then the 3 questions that I've tended to ask, or again, my co-authors and I have explored, include what are the skills that immigrants bring to the U.S. economy? What are the economic effects of this increased supply of skills? And then finally, how has U.S. government policy and policy intervention changed the supply of immigrant skills in the economy? Okay, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to think about skills in a broad context and not just think about education. However, it is kind of useful to think about immigration occurring in 2 separate labor markets. One that focuses on work performed by people that have a high school degree or less education, and another that focuses on work that's performed by people with a bachelor's degree or more education. Okay, so let's focus on the first topic here and think about workers with a high school degree or less education. The first insight that I'd like you to walk away with is to think about how immigrants and native-born people, native-born Americans do very different kinds of work. And in particular, when you're asking or thinking about workers with a high school degree or less education, it turns out that native-born Americans tend to focus on communication-based skills, and immigrants do work that's specializing in manual labor kinds of skills. You can see evidence for this just by looking at the different kinds of occupations that these workers do. And so here's a couple of pie charts that really highlight that fact. Okay, so this is again just thinking about workers without any college experience at all. On the left panel here, we're looking at native-born workers, and the right-hand panel, we're looking at foreign-born workers. And we're just asking, what are the kinds of occupations that people do? And it turns out that native-born workers are much more likely to do managerial work, supervisor kinds of jobs. They also do a lot of sales work and administrative support kind of work. That would include like clerical positions. Immigrants, in contrast, don't do a lot of that kind of labor, but instead do like a lot of agriculture and construction kind of labor. And so think about construction laborers, being here in this category, work that foreign-born people do, whereas something like a construction foreman would be a managerial job that native-born people are more likely to do. Well, that kind of regularity carries with it a lot of implications. The first one is that immigration does not lead to direct competition with American workers in the way that a lot of people fear that it might. What it does instead is it leads to an increase in the manual skills of the economy. And so it's not just that the labor force is increasing, it's that the manual labor, that the supply of manual skills is increasing. And so that in turn implies that there'd be a decrease in the wage that's paid to manual skills. It also implies that it increases wages paid for complementary skills, which would include things like this communication-based work. It also then creates an opportunity for somebody to move from a manual skill job into a communication-based one. So you could think of this as, suppose there's a big increase in supply of construction workers in California. A native-born American might respond to that by then becoming a construction foreman or a supervisor who's then in charge of a lot of foreign-born workers doing the heavy lifting kind of stuff. What this implies in aggregate is that when you think about how immigration is affecting American wages, this is where some of that, not very much, that there's very little effect in the aggregate where that answer comes from. But I think that one of the things that's lost in that discussion is that there are a lot of distributional consequences, and in particular, it implies that immigration can be pretty great for wages paid to Americans in communication-based jobs. It's really great for any American who moves from these manually intense jobs into these communication-based ones. But it's actually really bad for the wages that are paid to Americans who are in manually intense jobs who didn't change the kinds of work that they do. So if you imagine that there was somebody who might have been picking apples in 1980 and continued to pick apples 20 years later in 2000, well, that's a person who's actually seen real appreciable declines in their standard of living, right? And so where we might say, on average, immigration in this context is not having much of an effect at all, it's certainly having a very detrimental effect on a maybe a narrowly defined group of workers. And we should consider that. It kind of relates to Jenny's story just a little while ago, where we talk about winners and losers from immigration. Okay. What I want to do now is move from that discussion of workers without any college experience into a discussion about workers with a college degree or more education, and carry some of that intuition from that previous story with us. Okay. Second insight that I want you to think about is that among workers with a college degree, that same occupational skill story happens, that occupational specialization story still happens. Natives are still specializing in communication skills. The one difference is that among college-educated workers, nobody's really doing manual heavy lifting kind of work. Instead, what immigrants are specializing in is quantitative skills. Okay? Again, you can see that a little bit by just looking at pie charts on the kinds of occupations that people have. You see that American-born people are more likely to be managers. They're a little bit more likely to be in sales and administrative support kind of occupations. They're also much more likely to be teachers or professors. But where you see foreign-born people specializing is really in this STEM work, this science, technology, engineering, and mathematics occupations, right? Specializing in the innovative kind of work that, again, Jenny was talking about just a couple minutes ago. So what are the implications of this kind of regularity? Well, we can say that immigration, what it does is it increases the supply of quantitative, or if you like, STEM skills in the American economy. Now, if you were to carry over the intuition from the less educated labor market, you might say, okay, well, so if we have this increase in STEM skills, shouldn't we then worry that the wage paid to STEM skills decreases as well? And here I say, no, because there's another little wrinkle that we need to think about, and that's what the third insight that we need to consider is. Okay? That third insight is that STEM workers are responsible for most of the technological progress in recent decades, and that this technology, what it does is, to use an economist word, it creates positive externalities, or maybe more generally, what it does is it creates these really nice economic gains that spill over into many of the different sectors of the economy, and it's something that economists really think is the key contributor to long-run, sustained economic growth, whether you're talking about GDP growth or wage growth, that technology is good for, to use Jenny's phrase, expanding the pie of the economy. Okay? And so we can kind of think about how immigrants, by specializing in a lot of these STEM fields, what they're able to do is that they're able to generate a lot of widespread economic gains for a lot of people throughout the economy. Okay. So a little bit more specifically, quantitatively, I would argue that immigrants were responsible for about 2/3 of the growth of the STEM workforce in the United States between 1990 and 2010, and about 1/3 of the productivity growth of the American economy over the same period. They also thereby kind of increase wages paid to college-educated Americans, in part because STEM innovation complements education or people who have college degrees. There's a little bit of a caveat, though, that we should worry about, again, thinking about some of the distributional consequences here, and that's to say that new technologies are disruptive. They tend to replace a lot of jobs that involve a lot of routine work. And so you could argue then that immigrants who are doing STEM work and generating new technologies don't actually help increase the wages paid to some workers, including some workers that don't have college degrees. And so you might argue then that immigration does contribute to skill-biased technological change. Okay. So that's how I think wages are affected. Now I want to turn to this final story of some of the work that I've participated in, and that's just asking, how has government policy affected immigration and skill mix in the economy? And I'm going to study that by thinking about the H-1B program specifically. Okay, so for anybody who's unfamiliar, the H-1B program is the program that the U.S. has that allows firms to temporarily hire foreign workers in specialty occupations. These are basically occupations that require a college degree and also fashion models. But usually we think of it as the high-skilled. That's not a new Trumpian policy. That's the way it's been for a long, long time. But that's what the H-1B program is. These workers, they tend to be STEM workers. That's not something that's legislated. It's just sort of something that, because the H-1B program's been popular among STEM workers and technology firms. But because of that kind of specialty. It's something that's led a lot of people, including myself and my co-authors, to argue that the H-1B program is pretty good. It's helpful for generating these technology gains that I was talking about just a couple minutes ago. However, there are a lot of people who hate the program. Their central concerns, I would say, that really focus on this fear that it represents some kind of a competition with American-born workers, that foreigners coming in might be stealing Americans' jobs, something like that. There's also a secondary concern that people cite a lot that I'll touch on just a little bit today, which is that maybe the program is used somehow to outsource jobs to foreign countries, in particular computer-related work being outsourced to India. And so we'll talk about that, as I said, just a little bit in a few slides. But importantly, the government is aware of these concerns and has responded by not only putting a quota, a limit on the number of H-1B workers that can enter into the country, but also having drastically reduced that quota. And so one of the things that we saw is that in the early 2000s, the H-1B quota was pretty high, that there were 195,000 new H-1Bs that could be issued to employees of for-profit firms each year. But that was drastically reduced to just 65,000 per year in 2004. It's currently at about 85,000, so much, much lower than it was at its peak. Okay? It's also true that the program has been super, super popular in recent years. So it turns out that in the first week of the first week in which a person could apply for an H-1B, there were more than 230,000 applications received, meaning that only 1/3 of the people applying for H-1Bs could actually get one. And in those years, it turns out that all of the cap-bound H-1Bs were distributed by random lottery. That's how it's operated in recent years. Okay, so what we can do with these kind of policy shocks, if you like, is we can ask whether these policy shocks had the intended consequences and also kind of explore some of the unintended consequences. So let's first think about the intended effects. Okay. Whether or not you like the H-1B program doesn't really matter here. It's clear that the motive for decreasing the H-1B cap was to reduce the number of H-1B workers entering into the country. And so we can ask, well, did that happen? And we've argued that, yeah, it did. In this instance, policy was effective in accomplishing its goal. If you want some numerical results, you see that we estimate that about, say, 20% of that in the years following the policy change, about a 20% decline in new H-1Bs coming into the country compared to what would have happened if demand had been unconstrained. In later years, when we had the lottery that was distributing visas, that it actually decreased the H-1B flow even more compared to what it would have been. And so you say, okay, fine, intended consequences, those have occurred. But I think what's more interesting is to think about the unintended effects. One of which is it turns out that by reducing the number of H-1Bs available, it's actually led to a decline in the ability of foreign students who want to study in America. Now that's a really interesting kind of outcome because this is not a policy that applies to students themselves, it applies to workers. But the intuition is that a lot of people want to study in the US, hoping to one day enter the US labor market, and it turns out that if you close that labor market to them, their interest in studying here goes down. Moreover, it's not just the quantity of students is lower than what it otherwise might have been, it's the ability as well, and we can measure that by looking at SAT scores. We find that the SAT scores of prospective students declined by about 1.5%. That's driven primarily by a decline in math scores. And maybe most concerning, it's concentrated among the highest ability students. And so one of the implications of that is that it implies that we might be deterring our best and brightest students, right? That those people who could maybe really generate those productivity gains, those innovative gains that could generate macroeconomic technology gains and all that sort of stuff, that those are the students who are discouraged from coming here. We could also ask, well, what is the unintended effect on the ability of H-1B workers, so not the students? Here again, we see a pronounced decline in H-1B recipients at the tails of the wage offer distribution. So you might say that the highest and lowest ability workers are not coming here as much as they used to. Intuition here is that if you're a high ability worker and you have a choice between, I don't know, staying at home or working for in some country like Canada, the UK, or Australia, where you know you can get a legal right to work, that you might choose that job opportunity over one in America where you have to subject yourself to a random lottery. Again, this is a bit of a concern because it suggests that we're deterring the highest ability H-1B workers from coming to the U.S. Finally, it changes the composition of H-1B workers as well. There's this kind of ironic effect that people are concerned that the H-1B program facilitates outsourcing efforts to India and computer science workers. Well, it turns out that unintentionally, the cut in the H-1B program led to a higher proportion of H-1Bs going to Indian-born computer science workers. So I think that's just kind of an ironic result. A result that might be a little bit more concerning is that it's increased the concentration of H-1B workers in just a smaller subset of firms. That in itself makes a lot of sense because small firms really can't afford the inherent randomness of the lottery and the uncertainty that winning or losing the H-1B lottery implies. And so really what you see is that some of these big firms that try to hire lots of H-1B workers, they're continuing to participate in that program. But some of the smaller firms, some of the startup firms, that sort of thing, are much less inclined to do so compared to what they did in an unconstrained environment. Okay, so my closing thoughts here, again, just kind of open with the idea that immigration doesn't depress wages to native-born Americans as much as a lot of people might fear that they would. The reasons being is because they supply different skills than what Americans typically supply themselves. And when you're talking about highly educated immigrants, there's a lot of these innovative gains that spread over throughout the economy as well. And then second, the policy that's limited these highly educated labor flows, they directly decrease the technological capacity of the economy by limiting the number of high-skilled workers in the economy overall, but also kind of indirectly decrease technology by deterring the best and brightest students and workers from coming into the country. And so I think that's something to be concerned about as well. Thank you very much. Are there questions? Michael.
One comment, one question. First, you're right to call me out for implying that the wage effects of immigration is not an issue. They're super interesting questions. I'm delighted that really people are studying them properly as we do. My point was more about what I see as the misallocation of resources across the whole discipline, focusing maybe a little too much on that. The question, and this is one that I hear often, and it won't be new to you, but I'm just curious about your thoughts, is automation in the medium term likely to utterly change the equation on specialization benefits of low-skilled labor? So in 10 years, when it's actually plausible that there won't be any more immigrant taxi driver jobs in New York at all,
Right.
Will that fundamentally change the specialization argument for low-skilled workers?
I'm going to defer a little bit to Giovanni on that because he's got a paper, really recent paper, co-authored by Ahmed Rahman and Gaetano Bozzo, is that right? That kind of looks at this issue that technology is a shock that's led to the polarization of kind of a polarized wage effect in the economy. And it's kind of interesting that immigration seems to have dampened some of that polarization a little bit. So immigrants going into cities, you don't see as much polarization happening. But that's not my paper, that's his, so I'm gonna kind of punt on that. to kind of address your comment more, it's interesting because I was thinking about, the tie to, maybe I should have tied this talk a little bit to the philosophy angle more than I did. But the reality is that I'm really bad at constructing or refuting moral arguments, and a little bit better at testing sort of claims that people make. And so if we get into these debates on what's the morality of immigration and should we or should we not let more immigrants in, I think that's a really interesting discussion to have. But if you find yourself confronted with somebody who says, well, I don't like immigration because they depress wages, well, that's an empirically testable claim that we can kind of address here, and I think a fun perspective to bring to the debate. Yes?
So on the slide regarding students, right, you mentioned that H-1B has direct impact on the ability, on the willingness and ability of students to come to the United States for higher education.
Yes.
You seem to be implying then that, to a certain extent, that the job market for those with similar qualifications, so international students coming to America, and H-1B applicants are inelastic. Are you trying to make this implication? And is it specific to that sort of demographic, or is it just happen to be a psychological, oh, I see H-1Bs exist, so why should I come to America?
That's a really good question. In the background of our mind is an idea that we can't test, and that's that there are alternatives to an American education that people are gravitating toward instead. Places like Australia and Canada that both have large education markets that are attracting foreign students and fairly open labor markets available to them afterwards. Functionally, the way that we empirically test the claim that we make, what's happening, is that I had mentioned that the H-1B cap decreased for everybody. What I didn't mention is that there are 5 countries that have exceptions to so if you're from Canada, Mexico, Chile, Singapore, or Australia, you have alternative pathways to the U.S. labor market, alternatives to the H-1B program, and so we can kind of use them as a control group and immigrants from other countries as a treatment group to see what's happening to the trends in SAT scores, and we also do a little case study to look at GPAs and find out that the GPAs and the SAT scores of high school students from those countries decline relative to those 5 control countries. Yes?
Hi, I'm Arvin, philosophy teacher at NYU. I was wondering, this might be too big of a question, so ignore it. But if you could talk a little bit about possible impacts on economic equality in the U.S. by with immigration. It sounds like it's sort of talking about immigration of very low-skilled workers and of high-skilled workers. And
Yeah.
I'm having this sort of picture in my mind where
Yeah.
increases in polarization of wages in the U.S. And I'm just curious if there's any work on whether immigration increases economic inequality, even if it increases supply or doesn't, either things that impact everyone.
Yeah, no, very, very good question. In the context of what I presented here, you can think of this idea of skilled bias technological change as a form of potentially increasing inequality between, say, the college-educated people who are using technologies, and it's complementing them, but kind of also replacing routine kind of work. And so you can think of it as potentially contributing to that at some level. It's also, to turn it back to the distributional story, and I think that that's an important one, right? The bulk of my breath is spent talking about how immigration is good for the American economy, or it has very little effect on wages. And at the same time, it's clear that there are some people who lose out because, sort of anecdotally, Arizona is a state that's received a lot of immigrants. If you were in a manual job in Arizona 20 years ago and you're still doing that same job now, that it's absolutely true that their wages will have declined in response to immigration. And so that kind of almost, I say that almost to sort of humanize the concerns of a very vocal community who are anti-immigrant, right? Like I can understand why a person in that situation would be so adamantly opposed to immigration. And this is sort of a normative political statement, but I think if that's the concern, we'd want to think about redistributing the aggregate gains to the economy, if that makes sense. You know, aggregate gains, that pie gets bigger, you can chop it up differently if that's what you want to do, but also, of course, being cognizant of the fact that somebody is suffering, hurting.
Okay, I think we have reached the allotted time for this session. We thank again all the speakers.
Thank you.